I was dying in my own room when my son quietly left the door open for a stranger. I could not move, not even a single finger. Heavy footsteps came closer. Then I heard him whisper, "Make it look natural. Do not mess this up." What happened next still haunts me. Before I continue this story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth, because what I am about to tell you will test everything you believe about loyalty. I am Harrison Caldwell. I am 70 years old. Over the past 4 decades, I built a commercial real estate empire in Seattle from nothing. I poured my youth into concrete and steel. I thought my wealth would be a shield that would protect my family for generations. Instead, it became the trap that locked me in. Right now, I am a prisoner inside my own body. I am lying flat on my back in the center of the master suite of my custom-built home. The ceiling above me is painted a crisp white. I know every detail of that ceiling because it is the only thing I have been able to look at for weeks. I suffer from a condition that has paralyzed me entirely. I cannot blink on command. I cannot speak. I cannot swallow without the help of a machine. The only sounds in the room are the steady hum of the medical equipment keeping me alive and the soft rush of the central air conditioning. My mind, however, is perfectly sharp. I can hear everything. I can feel the cool breeze from the vent against my cheek. I can smell the faint scent of the expensive lavender detergent the maids use on my cotton sheets. And then the heavy oak door of my bedroom clicks open. The sound is sharp, cutting through the rhythmic hum of my oxygen concentrator. I cannot turn my head to look, but I do not need to. I know the rhythm of those footsteps. They are confident, carrying the weight of a man who believes the world owes him everything. It is Derek, my son. The boy I raised alone after his mother passed away. The boy I gave the best of everything I had to offer. He steps fully into my peripheral vision. The first thing that hits my senses is his cologne. It is an exclusive designer brand, rich and aggressively arrogant. It is a scent that costs $400 a bottle. A bottle that I ultimately paid for because he relies on the corporate credit card. He stops at the foot of my bed, looking down at me. I stare blankly ahead, playing the part of the empty shell he believes me to be. To him, I am merely a delayed inheritance, a breathing obstacle standing between him and the life he feels he rightfully deserves. But Derek is not alone. A second set of footsteps enters the room. These steps are different. They are careful, deliberate, and practically silent. They do not belong to my regular nurses or the expensive private doctor Derek hired for me. A stranger steps into the narrow field of my vision, standing right beside my son. The man is dressed in dark clothing. His face is entirely devoid of emotion, a blank canvas of absolute indifference. He looks at me the way a mechanic looks at a broken, obsolete machine. Then comes a sound that sends a jagged spike of pure ice straight through my veins. The sharp, tight snap of latex surgical gloves being pulled over large hands. My heart rate monitor is muted, a deliberate instruction Derek gave the staff days ago under the guise of wanting me to rest peacefully. If it were on, the alarms would be screaming right now. Inside my paralyzed chest, my heart is hammering a frantic rhythm. I am screaming internally. I am thrashing, fighting, demanding answers. But on the outside, I remain completely motionless, a silent stone figure buried under blankets. Derek leans slightly toward the stranger. "Are you absolutely certain he will not wake up or react?" the stranger asks. His voice is a gravelly whisper. It is the voice of a man who does this for a living. A cleaner. A shadow hired to fix severe problems. Derek lets out a low, humorless chuckle. It is a sound so callous that it feels like a physical blow to my chest. "My dad is a clueless old man," Derek replies, his tone dripping with absolute contempt. "He has been completely out of it for weeks. He does not feel a single thing, and his brain is basically mush at this point. Do not worry about him. Just get the job done quickly." I listen to my only son dismiss my entire existence. A lifetime of providing, of building, of protecting, reduced to the words, "clueless old man." The grief is suffocating, but it is instantly overshadowed by a tidal wave of primal terror. The stranger steps closer to the right side of my bed. My right arm is resting on top of the covers, a thin intravenous line taped securely to the back of my hand. The IV delivers my hydration and essential nutrients. It is my literal lifeline. The stranger reaches into the inner pocket of his dark jacket. When his hand emerges, the dim light catches the glint of plastic and steel. It is a syringe. The barrel is filled with a completely clear liquid. It looks exactly like harmless saline. But the cold precision with which the stranger handles it tells me everything I need to know. This is not medicine. This is the end. Make it look natural, Derek whispers, his voice tightening with a sudden edge of profound anxiety. The medical examiner cannot find anything suspicious. I have the private doctor in my pocket, but we cannot risk a full autopsy. Do not mess this up. The corporate auditors are coming next week, and the inheritance has to trigger before they freeze the accounts. Potassium chloride, the stranger whispers back, his latex-covered thumb, gently tapping the side of the syringe to clear a tiny air bubble. It stops the heart almost instantly. By the time anyone runs a blood test, it just looks like a sudden cardiac arrest, completely natural for a man in his fragile condition. Just relax. You will be a very rich man by morning. I watch in absolute horror as the stranger's gloved fingers reach out and gently grasp the plastic port of my IV line. I can feel the slight pressure on the back of my hand as he uncaps the port. The needle hovers just millimeters away from the entry point. This is it. This is how the great Harrison Caldwell dies. Not in a boardroom, not of old age, but murdered in his own bed by a hired thug while his son watches. I try to force a signal to my arm, to my leg, to my throat. Move. Please, just move. But the paralysis holds me tight. I am a captive audience to my own execution. The stranger presses the tip of the syringe into the rubber seal. He looks up at Derek, waiting for the final nod. Derek does not look away. He does not shed a tear. He simply stares down at me, his eyes cold and empty, and gives a slow, deliberate nod. As the stranger's thumb applies pressure to the plunger, my mind violently snaps back, desperately searching for the moment this nightmare began. How did my empire crumble into this single deadly moment? To understand the sheer depth of this betrayal, and how I ultimately turned this death sentence into the most ruthless lesson of my son's life, I have to take you back exactly 3 months. Back to the day my legs first betrayed me and the day my son first began to dig his own grave. The rubber seal yields. The pressure on the plunger increases. In that fraction of a second, my mind violently snaps back, plunging away from the lethal needle and into the memory of how this nightmare took root. It was exactly 3 months ago. There were no ominous warnings. It happened on a Tuesday morning, during the most critical board meeting of my career. We were closing a massive acquisition that would cement the Caldwell legacy. I stood at the head of the mahogany table, commanding the room as I had done for 40 years. My voice was steady, my mind sharp, and my authority absolute. I remember reaching for my glass of water. As my fingers closed around the cold crystal, a strange, creeping numbness crawled up my right arm. I ignored it, chalking it up to fatigue. I took a breath to finalize the vote. But when I shifted my weight to step forward, my legs simply vanished beneath me. It was a complete mechanical failure. I crashed to the floor, my shoulder hitting the edge of the heavy table. The glass shattered, sending ice and water scattering across the polished wood. The room erupted into chaos. Executives leaped from their chairs. Voices shouted my name. I lay there on the damp carpet, staring up at the horrified faces of my colleagues. I tried to stand, but my legs refused to obey. They felt like dead lead. For a man who had built his entire identity on unshakable strength, the sudden helplessness was far more terrifying than the fall. The ambulance ride was a blur of flashing lights. Over the next few weeks, that initial terrifying collapse spiraled into a relentless physical decline. My body, a once perfect engine, began to systematically shut down. The numbness spread from my legs to my arms, then crept slowly up my spine. My grip weakened to the point where holding a pen felt like lifting a boulder. Walking became an agonizing chore, and then completely impossible. I was subjected to endless batteries of tests at the finest hospitals in Seattle. Neurologists and chief medical officers stood around my bed with furrowed brows. They ran scans, drew vials of blood, and mapped my brain activity, but they could find no definitive cause. They muttered about autoimmune responses and atypical neurological events, but their uncertainty only fueled my growing panic. Every morning I woke up, I found that another piece of my independence had been stripped away. I went from a cane to a walker, and then to a wheelchair. My speech began to slur, making my commands sound like the clumsy babbling of a drunk. The commanding voice that had closed massive corporate deals was reduced to a pathetic mumble. It was a slow, agonizing erasure of my dignity. That was when Derek stepped out of the shadows and took center stage. The transition was flawlessly executed. At the time, I saw it only as the ultimate act of filial devotion. My son swooped in, projecting the image of a deeply concerned heir, ready to carry his ailing father's burden. He took an indefinite leave from his own projects to be by my side. He dismissed my regular household staff, claiming they were unequipped to handle my sensitive medical needs. He brought in his own people, professionals who answered directly and exclusively to him. "You need the absolute best, Dad," he told me one evening, his hand resting warmly on my paralyzed shoulder. "We cannot trust these hospital bureaucracies anymore. They are just guessing. I am bringing you home. I will manage your care personally." I was too exhausted by the relentless deterioration to argue. I was moved out of my upstairs bedroom and relocated to the massive guest suite. Derek completely transformed it. He outfitted the room with modern medical equipment, mechanized beds, and automated climate control. It looked like a luxury intensive care unit. I thought he was building me a sanctuary to heal. I did not realize he was constructing my high-tech tomb. The heavy doors were replaced with solid oak. He created a silent vacuum where no one could hear me and no one could see me without his permission. Once I was fully isolated, Derek introduced the final piece of his carefully constructed narrative. He told me he had secured the services of a highly exclusive private concierge physician, a man who specialized in rare, untreatable conditions for very wealthy clients. His name was Dr. Aris. From the moment Aris walked into my room, my instincts warned me something was off. He did not wear the empathetic expression of a healer. He wore a tailored suit and carried himself with the slick demeanor of a corporate fixer. Aris did not order new scans. He simply examined the hospital charts Derek provided, ran a penlight across my eyes, and offered a devastatingly swift diagnosis. He stood at the foot of my bed, speaking with practiced sorrow. "Mr. Caldwell, I am afraid the news is grave," Aris said, his voice perfectly modulated. "You are suffering from an exceptionally rare, aggressive variant of motor neuron disease. It mimics the rapid onset of ALS, but it moves much faster. The myelin sheaths around your nerves are degenerating. Your muscles will continue to fail, eventually reaching your respiratory system." I stared at him, my heart plummeting into my stomach. "How long?" I managed to ask, the words thick on my numb tongue. Aris sighed, casting a solemn glance toward Derek, who looked appropriately devastated. "Months, perhaps. With the right care, we can manage the pain. But there is no cure. The paralysis will become total." The diagnosis hit me like a physical blow. I lay there absorbing the reality that my life was effectively over. I would never walk through my corporate headquarters again. I would simply fade away, a prisoner in my own failing body. Derek sat on the edge of the mattress. He took my hand in his. "I am here, Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking with grief. "I will handle everything. You do not have to worry about the company, the accounts, or the estate. I will take care of your legacy. Just rest. Let go of the stress." I looked at my son, feeling profound gratitude. In my darkest hour, he had stepped up to shield me. I believed his tears. I believed Dr. Aris and his diagnosis. I believed that my body was simply failing me completely, unaware that the rapid degeneration was not an act of cruel nature, but a methodical, calculated poisoning. The trap was set perfectly. My isolation was complete. My medical narrative was legally established by a corrupt physician. My son had successfully cordoned me off from the outside world, creating a sealed environment where he could execute the next phase of his plan without interference. As the memory of that fake diagnosis fades, bringing me rushing back to the present moment, to the needle hovering over my IV port, I realize how perfectly Derek played the devoted son. He used my fear and my trust to lock me in this room. And once the door was closed, the devoted son vanished. It happened 3 days after Dr. Aris delivered his fabricated death sentence. By that point, the supposed disease had progressed with terrifying speed. I had been transferred from the bed to a specialized motorized wheelchair. My posture was slumped, my spine unable to support the weight of my own shoulders. My vocal cords had thickened, turning my commanding baritone into a wet slur. I was stripped of my dignity, left to sit by the window of my suite, staring out at the manicured lawns I could no longer walk across. That morning, the heavy oak doors parted and Derek walked in. His wife Monica trailed closely behind him. Monica had always been a creature of calculated elegance. Usually her demeanor toward me was one of polite, distant tolerance. But today she was playing a completely different role. She rushed to my side, dropping to her knees beside my wheelchair. She buried her face in my limp lap, letting out soft, perfectly pitched sobs. When she looked up, her mascara was flawlessly smudged, framing eyes that swam with photogenic tears. She stroked my useless hands, murmuring about how unfair life was, how much they loved me, and how they would do absolutely anything to protect me. It was an Oscar-worthy performance designed to disarm whatever defenses I had left. Derek stepped forward carrying a thick leather briefcase. He looked exhausted, rubbing his temples as if carrying the weight of the entire world. He pulled up a chair and sat directly in front of me, leaning in close to establish an air of intimate urgency. He spoke in a hushed, confidential tone, the exact register we used to use when discussing high-stakes acquisitions in the boardroom. He told me that rumors of my collapse had leaked to the financial press. The market was reacting poorly. Shareholders were beginning to panic. Investors were threatening to pull out of our downtown development project. He explained that the board of directors was terrified by the lack of visible leadership, and competitors were already circling like vultures. He painted a picture of an empire on the brink of total collapse using the very business logic he knew I respected above all else. "I have been trying to hold them off, Dad," Derek said, his voice cracking with manufactured strain. "I have told them you are just taking a temporary medical leave, that you will be back. But they want legal assurances. They need to know someone has the authority to sign the development checks to approve the payroll to keep the lights on while you focus entirely on your recovery. The banks are threatening to freeze our operational accounts by Friday if we do not show a clear chain of command." He reached into his briefcase and produced a stack of crisp, heavy legal documents, placing them gently onto the tray of my wheelchair. He uncapped a heavy gold fountain pen, the very pen I had gifted him when he graduated from business school. "It is just a temporary power of attorney, Dad," Derek assured me, his eyes wide and earnest. "It gives me the legal authority to sign off on the daily operations. It keeps the shareholders calm and the banks happy. The moment you are strong enough, we tear this up. I do not want your chair. I just want to keep your seat warm to protect the legacy you built for us. You need to focus on healing, not on pacifying a bunch of terrified investors." It was a brilliantly constructed lie. It was plausible, logical, and appealed directly to my protective instincts. I looked at the documents. The words blurred together, my vision compromised by the weakness stealing my muscles. I looked at my son. This was the boy I had raised alone after my wife Martha passed away from breast cancer 20 years ago. I had poured all my grief over losing Martha into building up this company, ensuring Derek would never want for anything. I had taught him how to read a balance sheet, how to look a man in the eye, and negotiate with honor. I looked at him, and I did not see a predator. I saw my boy stepping up to shield me from the wolves. I wanted to tell him how proud I was. I wanted to tell him that Martha would be proud of the man he had become. But when I tried to speak, my jaw trembled and only a thick, guttural groan escaped my lips. "Shh, do not try to speak, Dad," Derek said gently, placing his hand over mine. "Save your strength. I have got you. I promise I have got you." He pressed the gold fountain pen into my right hand. At that time, I still had a fraction of motor control left in my fingers, just enough to form a rudimentary scrawl. Monica stood up, wiping her flawless tears, and guided my elbow to position the pen over the signature line. The physical effort required to hold the pen was agonizing. Sweat beaded on my forehead. My lungs burned as I forced my hand to drag the nib across the paper. It took 2 full minutes to sign my name on the final page. My signature, once a bold declaration of authority, was reduced to a fragile scribble. But it was legal. It was binding. The moment the pen slipped from my exhausted fingers and clattered onto the tray, the atmosphere in the room fundamentally altered. It was not something you could see, but something you could feel, like the sudden drop in barometric pressure before a violent storm. The weeping daughter-in-law instantly stopped crying. Monica stood up straight, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from her designer skirt. Her face smoothed out, the mask of sorrow evaporating into a look of bored calculation. She did not look at me again. She simply turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. The exhausted, devoted son vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stranger. He tapped the stack of documents against the table to align the edges, slipping them back into his leather briefcase. He snapped the golden clasps shut. The sound echoed in the quiet room, like the locking mechanism of a prison cell door slamming shut. He did not stroke my hand again. He offered no more words of comfort. He picked up his briefcase, straightened his tie, and looked down at me. There was no warmth in his eyes, only the sterile satisfaction of a corporate raider executing a hostile takeover. "Rest well, Dad," he said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. He turned his back on me and walked out of the room, pulling the heavy oak doors shut behind him. The thick wood sealed with a heavy thud. I sat there in my wheelchair, trapped in the silence, the gold fountain pen lying uselessly on my tray. I had surrendered my wealth, autonomy, and legal voice to the man draining my life away. The trap had snapped shut completely, leaving me to face the darkest truth of my existence. Within 2 weeks of receiving that diagnosis, the remaining strength in my limbs evaporated entirely. I was moved from the motorized wheelchair to the mechanized bed, a permanent fixture in the silent room. My universe shrank to the 4 walls of the guest suite, the hum of the monitors, and scheduled visits from my son and his wife. I was now entirely at their mercy, completely dependent on them for my basic human needs. I could not feed myself. I could not turn my head. I could only stare at the ceiling and wait. It was during the evening feedings that the first true crack in their flawless facade appeared. Monica was usually the one who brought my dinner. She would enter the room carrying a silver tray, wearing her designer loungewear, her face painted with a look of overwhelming pity. She would sit beside the bed, adjust my pillows with an exaggerated sigh, and speak to me in a voice she might use for a slow child. She never spoke about the company or the outside world. She only spoke about her exhaustion, the burden of my care, and how brave they were for taking this on without outside help. One particular evening, the air in the room felt heavy. Monica placed the tray on the bedside table. On the tray sat a small porcelain bowl of lukewarm chicken broth and a small mortar and pestle. "Time for your supplements, Harrison," she cooed, not looking me in the eye. "Dr. Aris said these are crucial for slowing the nerve degeneration. You have to take every single drop." I watched her hands very closely. Her manicured fingers tightly grasped the heavy stone pestle. She dropped 3 large, unmarked white capsules into the mortar and began to slowly grind them down into a fine powder. She always did this task with a strange, methodical intensity. There was absolutely no medical label on the bottle. There was no prescription pad, just a blank plastic container she carefully kept hidden deep inside her pocket. She scraped the white powder into the broth and stirred until it dissolved completely. Then she scooped up the liquid and brought it to my lips. I had no choice but to open my mouth. The broth slid over my tongue. I expected the bland taste of the soup she had been feeding me for weeks. Instead, my taste buds were assaulted by something entirely different. Beneath the surface of the chicken stock, there was a harsh, bitter tang. It was a heavy chemical flavor that coated the roof of my mouth and burned at the back of my throat. It tasted metallic, like chewing on old copper coins. I tried to gag to force the liquid out, but my throat muscles were simply too weak to obey my desperate command. I swallowed. The bitter liquid burned all the way down deep into my stomach. Monica smiled, wiping my chin with a linen napkin. "Good job," she whispered, her voice entirely devoid of warmth. "Just a few more bites now." She fed me the rest of the bowl scoop by agonizing scoop. Every swallow brought the same revolting metallic burn. For a man who had spent his entire life trusting his gut instincts, that bitter taste was an alarm bell ringing in the silent cathedral of my paralyzed mind. It was not medicine. Medicine tasted chalky or sterile. This tasted like poison. Later that same night, the second piece of the puzzle fell into place. The room was dark, illuminated only by the soft blue glow of the medical monitors. Derek walked in to check the locks on the windows, a routine he performed every evening to ensure my absolute isolation. He stood near the edge of my bed, bathed in the dim light of the screens. He pulled out his phone to send a text message, raising his left arm. As his shirt cuff slid back, my eyes caught the heavy gleam of platinum and sapphire. I recognized the timepiece instantly. It was a bespoke, highly coveted watch that retailed for no less than $120,000. I knew exactly how much Derek made at my firm. I knew his mortgage payments, his car leases, and Monica's lavish monthly clothing allowances. There was absolutely no room in his legitimate financial reality for a watch of that caliber. He had not earned that watch. He had bought it with stolen funds. There was only one place that massive amount of cash could have come from. He was openly spending my money, the money he had tearfully promised to protect when he begged me to sign that power of attorney. The scattered puzzle pieces violently slammed together in my mind, forming a picture so horrifying it stole my breath. The sudden, inexplicable onset of my muscle paralysis, the smooth, rehearsed diagnosis from an unvetted, mysterious concierge doctor, the convenient legal documents forcefully shoved under my trembling pen when I was at my absolute weakest. The metallic, burning chemical taste hidden in my nightly bowl of chicken broth. The astronomical wealth suddenly appearing on my son's wrist. I was not dying of a rare motor neuron disease. I was being methodically, chemically dismantled. They were poisoning me. The realization was a terrifying plunge into absolute clarity. My own flesh and blood, the boy I groomed to take over my empire, was pouring venom down my throat to accelerate his inheritance. The power of attorney was not a shield. It was a master key to my vault. Derek was bleeding my life's work dry arrogantly, parading his stolen wealth in front of me while I lay trapped in a silent prison. He felt so completely secure in his deception, so confident in my impending death, that he did not even bother to hide the spoils of his treason. He wore the undeniable evidence of his betrayal on his wrist, knowing I could not speak to stop him. I lay completely still in the dark, the metallic burn lingering in my stomach. A profound, icy rage began to replace the despair that had paralyzed my spirit for months. I was a ruthless man who had crushed aggressive corporate raiders. I had built a legacy from nothing but ambition and grit. I refused to let my final chapter be written by a greedy child and his callous wife. If they thought I was just a clueless old man waiting to die, they had made a fatal miscalculation. I could not move my arms or my legs, but my mind was an impenetrable fortress. The surging anger became my fuel, burning away the fog of sickness. I needed a concrete plan. I needed undeniable proof. I needed a way to strike back from the grave they dug for me. To survive, I had to play my part perfectly. I had to continue swallowing their daily poison without flinching. I had to let them believe they were winning this game. But deep inside my broken body, the old wolf was finally waking up. The next evening, Monica arrived exactly on schedule. She carried the silver tray porcelain bowl and heavy stone mortar. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my face remained a frozen mask. I watched her grind 3 large white capsules into a fine powder, her perfectly manicured nails gripping the pestle. She stirred the powder into the broth. I knew the bitter metallic burn that would soon coat my throat. Accepting poison from her was almost unbearable. When she brought the first spoonful to my lips, my primal instinct was to clench my jaw shut. But any resistance would arouse suspicion. If I refused the food, Derek would bring a feeding tube. I had to play the dying man. I opened my mouth and let the toxic sludge slide over my tongue. I swallowed the first spoonful, actively fighting not to gag. She brought the second to my lips. As the toxic liquid hit my throat, my swallowing reflex faltered. A few drops slipped down my windpipe. My failing body reacted with a violent, involuntary spasm. A harsh cough ripped through my chest, fiercely, shaking my paralyzed frame. My eyes watered as I struggled desperately for air. Monica jumped back, startled by the sudden outburst. The silver spoon clattered loudly onto the tray. She gasped quickly, pulling her designer robe away to avoid the mess. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Harrison," she muttered, turning her back to grab napkins from the wooden dresser. In that fleeting fraction of a second, my survival instinct took over. I did not swallow the pooled broth. With a desperate exertion of my facial muscles, I let my jaw fall slack. Turning my head a fraction of an inch to the right, I let the liquid spill over my bottom lip. It dripped down my chin, falling silently onto the dark brown carpet beside the bed. The fibers instantly absorbed the moisture, hiding the evidence completely. By the time Monica turned back with the napkins, my mouth was empty. She wiped my chin with frustrated strokes. Looking at the remaining broth, she sighed heavily and decided she had done enough. She gathered the tray, unaware the poison was soaking into the floorboards. "Try to rest," she said coldly, leaving me alone in the dark. That victory became my blueprint. For the next 2 days, I perfected the art of the fake swallow. It required absolute concentration. When Monica fed me, I let the liquid pool in the pockets of my cheeks. I mimicked the throat movements of a swallow, pushing the soup backward without letting it slip down my esophagus. It was a dangerous game. One mistake meant ingesting the toxin I was avoiding, but fear is a powerful motivator. As soon as Monica turned away to check her phone, I let the liquid drool into the collar of my pajamas. It was uncomfortable. I lay in the dark, smelling the metallic stench drying against my skin. For 48 hours, not a drop entered my system. I spent those 2 agonizing days in a state of constant hypervigilance. I monitored every microscopic sensation, waiting for any sign the chemical fog was lifting. The silence of the sealed room felt incredibly oppressive. Listening to the steady rhythm of my oxygen machine, I focused all my remaining mental energy on my extremities. I sent desperate, silent commands to my toes, my knees, my hands. Move. Just move. Nothing happened. The dead weight of my limbs remained absolute. Doubt began creeping into my mind. Perhaps the diagnosis was real. Perhaps the bitter taste was just harmless medication. Perhaps I truly was dying of a degenerative disease and my paranoid mind was simply fabricating a villain. And then came the 3rd morning. The curtains were drawn, but a sliver of morning light pierced the gap, landing across my right hand. The house was silent. Derek and Monica were asleep upstairs. I stared at my hand bathed in that single beam of light. The skin looked pale, the veins prominent against the bone. I focused my gaze on my right index finger. I channeled every ounce of willpower I possessed, imagining the neural pathways firing, willing the electrical signals to travel down my arm and into my hand. I visualized the muscle contracting until my vision blurred, and then it happened. It was not a grand sweeping motion. It was not a sudden return of full mobility. It was a microscopic trembling spasm. My right index finger twitched. It lifted perhaps a quarter of an inch off the fabric, a tiny jerky movement before dropping back down. But I felt it. I felt the crisp friction of the cotton sheet against my fingertip. I felt the glorious, undeniable sensation of a voluntary muscle contraction. I tried again. Another focused burst of mental command. The finger twitched a second time, stronger now, bending slightly at the joint. A tear slipped from the corner of my eye, tracking hotly down my cheek. It was pure triumph. The implication of that tiny movement hit me with the force of a physical blow. The truth was no longer a paranoid suspicion. It was an undeniable, terrifying medical fact. I did not have an aggressive, rare motor neuron disease. My myelin sheaths were not degenerating. The brilliant, exclusive Dr. Aris was a complete fraud, a paid actor in a lethal theatrical production. The supplements were the sole source of my paralysis. My own flesh and blood, the son I had nurtured and protected, was systematically poisoning me. Derek was literally paralyzing his father to gain unchecked access to a real estate empire. He was murdering me in slow motion right under my own roof. The sheer scale of the betrayal was staggering. It was a cold, calculated, and breathtakingly evil plan. Derek had weaponized my love and my trust to turn me into a helpless prisoner. He had orchestrated a scenario where my eventual death would be viewed as a tragic natural conclusion to a terrible illness. He would play the grieving son at my funeral, inheriting my wealth while burying the evidence of his crime along with my body. The metallic taste in the broth was the taste of his greed. The heavy locked doors of the guest suite were the walls of my execution chamber. As I lay there, staring at my twitching finger, the last remnants of my paternal denial evaporated. The father who had loved Derek, who had forgiven his past mistakes and handed him the keys to the kingdom, died in that exact moment. In his place, the ruthless businessman who had built an empire from concrete and ambition was resurrected. I had faced hostile takeovers, corporate espionage, and ruthless competitors, but none had ever struck this close to the bone. Derek thought he had outsmarted me. He thought the game was already won, but he had made a fatal error. He left my mind intact, and now I had my first physical weapon back. A single twitching finger was all I needed to start dismantling his world. The war had just begun. The remainder of that day was a masterclass in deception. I lay completely motionless, staring at the white ceiling, while my mind raced with calculated fury. Beneath the heavy blanket shielded from prying eyes, I practiced. I focused every ounce of my willpower on that single right index finger. Twitch. Pause. Twitch. Bend. Over hours of invisible exertion, I managed to curl the finger entirely inward against my palm. The physical exhaustion was overwhelming, but the psychological triumph fueled me. I was reclaiming my territory, 1 millimeter of muscle at a time. The numbness was receding, chased away by the venom of my rage. I knew I had to maintain the absolute illusion of paralysis. If Derek or Monica noticed a fraction of a tremor, they would not wait for the poison to finish its slow work. They would smother me and call it respiratory failure. I had to become a ghost, haunting my own living body. Evening arrived, painting the room in the long shadows of twilight. The central air conditioning hummed its steady tune. Then the heavy oak doors clicked and swung open. I instantly let my jaw go slack. I widened my eyes into a vacant, unfocused stare, fixing my gaze on a meaningless spot on the opposite wall. My breathing remained shallow. I was a hollow shell, a monument to a dying man. Derek and Monica walked into the suite. They did not lower their voices. The pretense of the grieving family vanished the moment the doors sealed behind them. They walked past the foot of my bed without a glance at my face. Monica dropped her designer handbag onto the armchair. She let out a sigh, rubbing her temples. Derek walked directly to the mahogany credenza, grabbed a crystal decanter, and poured a generous measure of my scotch. The scent of the liquor wafted over me. I cannot stand the smell of this room anymore, Monica complained, her voice dripping with irritation. It smells like sickness and alcohol. How much longer are we supposed to play this waiting game, Derek? My parents are asking why we have not gone to Aspen. I am running out of excuses for staying locked up in this house. Derek took a long swallow of the scotch. The ice clinked sharply against the crystal. You think I want to be here? He snapped back, his tone laced with a frantic tension. You think I enjoy watching the old man linger on like this? It is taking too long. Aris assured me the dosage was high enough to shut down his organ systems by the end of the month. But he is stubborn. He is fighting it even now. I lay there listening to my son complain about my refusal to die on schedule. Monica crossed her arms, her heels tapping impatiently against the hardwood floor. Well, you need to tell Aris to double the dose. We are running out of time, Derek. Have you finished the transfers for this week? The men you are dealing with are not known for their patience. If you miss another deadline, they are not going to send a polite collection letter. Derek paced in front of the window. The transfers are processing, he said, his voice dropping into a panicked register. I used his signature stamp and the power of attorney to move another $4 million into the offshore holding company in the Caymans. It is enough to keep them quiet for 10 days. But the syndicate is demanding the entire balloon payment by the end of the quarter. $25 million. If I do not clear the books with the cartel, they are going to come for me. The revelation hit me with the destructive force of a wrecking ball. The missing money, the frantic need for the power of attorney, the astronomical watch on his wrist. It was not just petty corporate theft. My son had developed a catastrophic gambling addiction. He had bypassed the banks and borrowed heavily from a ruthless underground syndicate to cover his losses. When he could not pay, he offered them the only thing of value he had access to: my empire. He was systematically draining the liquid assets of my real estate firm, funneling millions through untraceable shell accounts to pay off the cartel. He was using the legacy I built with my own bare hands as a washing machine for criminal debt. Then just take the rest of it now, Monica demanded, her voice shrill and urgent. Empty the primary corporate accounts and pay them off. Let the company sink. We will take our cut and move to Europe. Derek slammed his glass down on the credenza. I cannot just empty the primary accounts, you idiot. The corporate auditors are scheduling their quarterly review. The chief financial officer is asking questions about the missing funds. If I move $25 million in one lump sum, while the old man is technically alive, and the primary shareholder, it triggers an automatic federal review. The feds will freeze everything, and the syndicate will kill me before the indictment comes down. He ran his hands through his hair. The only way this works cleanly is if the inheritance triggers. If he dies, the assets transfer directly to me. I can pay the cartel and walk away clean. Monica stared at him, the gravity of the situation smoothing out her petulant expression. Derek, if the auditors look at the books next week, we are both going to federal prison. Derek nodded, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat. I know, he whispered. That is why I called Aris. We cannot wait for the chemical degradation to finish the job. It is too slow, and it leaves too much room for error. I told Aris to arrange for a cleaner, someone outside our circle, someone who can guarantee the old man's heart stops before Monday morning. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. They stood there, two vultures waiting for the final breath, cornered by their own greed and stupidity. Derek was not just a greedy heir eager for his inheritance. He was a desperate, cornered animal willing to slaughter his father to save himself. Monica walked over to Derek and wrapped her arms around his waist. Just get it done, she murmured against his chest. I cannot live like this anymore. I want our life back. Derek kissed the top of her head. I will, he promised. By Monday, this room will be empty, and all our problems will be buried with him. They turned off the main lights, leaving only the dim blue glow of the monitors, and walked out. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, plunging me back into absolute silence. I lay perfectly still in the darkness, the full scope of the betrayal laying heavily on my chest. It was a desperate scramble for survival. The stakes had been raised to immediate life and death. Derek had ordered my execution. I had less than 5 days to dismantle a criminal conspiracy, save my life, and destroy the son who wanted me dead. I slowly curled my index finger. The war was right here. The war had just begun. But every war requires a true ally. I could not fight a ruthless cartel, a corrupt physician, and my treacherous son from a mechanized mattress. My isolation was a masterpiece of strategy. Derek had replaced the household staff with loyalists people paid to look the other way. They came during the day to turn my body and maintain the facade of premium care. However, there was a single flaw in Derek's perfect fortress. The health insurance policy I purchased years ago mandated third-party palliative monitoring during the night shift. Derek fought against it aggressively, citing his desire for absolute privacy, but the vast medical bureaucracy was an institution he could not easily manipulate without drawing immediate legal suspicion. Because of that policy, the night belonged to agency nurses. For weeks, they were blurry faces passing through the shadows. They checked my vitals and retreated. Then the agency sent Sarah. I noticed the difference on her first shift. Sarah was a seasoned professional in her late 40s, possessing a quiet, methodical competence that contrasted sharply with the performative grief of Monica or the callous indifference of Derek's crew. She adjusted my blankets, checked my intravenous lines, and stood by the window looking out at the darkened estate. She was observant. I watched her scrutinize the medical chart left by Dr. Aris, her brow furrowing slightly at the high dosages of sedatives. She trusted data, not narratives. She was my only chance. I waited for the perfect moment. It had to be the dead of night, long after Derek and Monica retreated to the master suite. I needed the absolute silence of the 2 o'clock hour. For 3 days, I hoarded my strength, practicing micro-movements of my right index finger beneath the heavy cotton sheets. Every fake swallow of Monica's poisoned broth gave me back a fraction of my neurological autonomy. On a Thursday night, the digital clock glowed an eerie red, displaying 2:15. The house was a tomb. Sarah sat in the corner armchair, illuminated only by the faint blue light of the cardiac monitor, quietly reading a paperback novel. I began the agonizing process of moving my hand. I focused every particle of my consciousness on my right wrist, willing it to rotate outward toward the mattress edge. It felt as though I were trying to move a mountain with a piece of twine. Sweat gathered at my temples. My heart rate elevated slightly, causing a minor spike on the monitor. Sarah glanced up from her book, her eyes scanning the screen. I immediately froze, letting my gaze drift back into the vacant stare of a vegetable. She watched the green line stabilize, adjusted her glasses, and went back to reading. I resumed the microscopic rotation. After 20 grueling minutes of silent, invisible exertion, the side of my right hand made contact with the cold, rigid steel of the medical bedrail. The metal was cool against my skin. I took a slow, shallow breath. I curled my index finger inward, gathering my strength, and brought the pad of my finger down against the hollow steel tube. It made a faint ping. I waited. Sarah did not move. I struck the metal again. Ping. And then a third time. Ping. 3 short taps. The letter S. I rested for a torturous 10 seconds, letting the muscles recover. Then I pressed my finger against the metal and dragged it slightly, creating a dull, resonant scrape. A dash. I repeated the scraping motion twice more. Dash. Dash. The letter O. I paused again, my finger burning with the effort, before delivering the final 3 short taps. Ping, ping, ping. SOS, the universal distress signal, a rhythm I had learned 50 years ago in the Naval Reserves. The sound was incredibly quiet, easily masked by the hum of the oxygen concentrator, but the rhythmic, deliberate pattern was undeniably unnatural. It was not the random twitch of a dying man. It was an intelligent design. Sarah stopped turning the page. The silence in the room suddenly felt electric. She slowly lowered the paperback to her lap. She did not immediately rush to the bed. Instead, she tilted her head, listening with the trained intensity of a seasoned medical veteran. I summoned the absolute dregs of my physical energy. I repeated the sequence. 3 short taps. 3 long scrapes. 3 short taps. SOS. Sarah slowly stood up. She moved across the dimly lit room with silent, deliberate steps. She cautiously approached the right side of the bed, leaning over the cold metal railing. Her face was inches from mine. For the first time in months, someone was looking at me not as a decaying corpse, but as a living human being. She looked down at my hand resting against the steel rail, and then she looked directly into my eyes. I dropped the vacant stare. I focused my pupils, locking my gaze intensely with hers. I poured every ounce of desperation, authority, and intelligence I possessed into that single look. Sarah inhaled sharply, a tiny gasp of pure shock escaping her lips. Her eyes widened behind her glasses. She understood. She knew I was in there. She glanced nervously over her shoulder toward the heavy oak doors, verifying we were entirely alone. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a barely audible whisper, a breath against my cheek. "Mr. Caldwell," she murmured. "Can you hear me?" I closed my eyes tightly, holding them shut for a full second, and then opened them. One deliberate, heavily exaggerated blink. Sarah swallowed hard. Her professional detachment cracked, replaced by a deep, urgent empathy. She quickly deduced the limitations of my communication. "Okay," she whispered, her eyes darting between my face and the closed door. "Okay, we have a system. 1 blink means yes. 2 rapid blinks mean no. Do you understand?" I closed my eyes. 1 firm blink. "Yes." "Are you experiencing physical pain right now?" she asked, her medical training automatically kicking in. I blinked twice rapidly. "No." She paused, studying my face, reading the absolute terror and lucidity behind my paralyzed features. Her voice trembled slightly as she asked the next crucial question. "Mr. Caldwell," Sarah whispered, her face pale in the blue light of the monitors. "Are you safe in this house?" The cardiac monitor beeped a slow, steady rhythm beside my resting head. I looked deeply at this stranger, this palliative nurse who had just shattered the thick walls of my isolation. I thought of Derek's watch. I thought of the poison masked in chicken broth. I thought of the massive offshore accounts and the impending audit that would trigger my execution. I closed my eyes. I held them shut for a long, heavy second, feeling the terrible weight of my reality. I opened my eyes. 1 blink. Yes. I was lucid. I stared directly at her, completely unblinking for a moment, making absolutely sure she had my full attention. I blinked twice rapidly. No. I was not safe. I was a hostage marked for imminent death, and she was now the only living person in the entire world who knew the absolute truth. Sarah did not recoil. She did not panic. The professional composure that had initially drawn my attention hardened into a fierce, quiet resolve. She looked toward the heavy oak doors once more, verifying the absolute silence of the house before leaning back over the cold metal railing of my bed. "I am going to help you, Mr. Caldwell," she whispered, her voice steady and resolute. "But we have to be incredibly careful. If they suspect I know anything, they will dismiss me immediately, and you will be left entirely alone. I need physical evidence to take to the authorities. I need to know exactly what is inside your system." She moved swiftly and silently to her medical supply cart. She bypassed the standard equipment Derek had provided and pulled a small, unmarked zipper pouch from the bottom of her personal tote bag. She returned holding a sterile syringe and a vacuum-sealed blood collection tube. "This is going to sting," she murmured. "Do not move a muscle." I lay perfectly still, staring at the ceiling, as she expertly found a vein in the crook of my left arm. The sharp prick of the needle, was the most beautiful sensation I had felt in months. It was the sting of salvation. I watched from the corners of my eyes as the dark red fluid filled the vial, my lifeblood carrying the undeniable proof of my son's treason. Sarah withdrew the needle, applied a small bandage, and immediately hid the vial deep inside her tunic pocket. "I have a friend who runs an independent toxicology laboratory across the city," she whispered, packing away her supplies. "I will take this to him as soon as my shift ends. They will run a comprehensive expedited panel. It will take at least 48 hours to process the results safely off the books. You have to hold on until then. Do exactly what you have been doing. Eat what they give you, but do not swallow the medicine. Play dead Caldwell. I will be back." The next 2 days were a masterclass in psychological torture. Time, which had already slowed to a crawl, practically stopped. Every tick of the wall clock echoed like a hammer strike against an anvil. I was a conscious prisoner trapped inside my failing body, forced to watch my executioners go about their daily routines. Monica continued to visit me during the evening, bringing her silver tray and her mortar and pestle. I perfected the art of deception. I accepted the spoonfuls of poisoned chicken broth, letting the metallic, bitter liquid pool in the pockets of my cheeks. I feigned a weak swallow, and then the moment she turned her back to check her phone, I let the toxic sludge drip silently down my chin onto the dark carpet. The smell of the chemicals drying against my skin was nauseating, but it fueled my rage. Derek visited less frequently, but his presence was far more volatile. He paced during his brief visits, barking orders into his phone. His voice carried the frantic, high-pitched edge of a man out of time. I listened to him negotiate with offshore bankers, his tone shifting from arrogant demands to thinly veiled panic. The underground syndicate was clearly tightening the noose around his neck. He stood over my bed on Saturday afternoon, staring down with cold, dead eyes. "Just let go, old man," he muttered under his breath, adjusting his bespoke platinum watch. "You are not doing anyone any favors by dragging this out. Aris said you should be gone by now. Stop fighting." I kept my eyes wide and vacant, my breathing shallow and erratic. I wanted to reach up and wrap my hands around his throat to crush the arrogance out of him. Instead, I lay motionless, an empty shell hiding the spark of life that was slowly returning to my right hand. Beneath the heavy cotton blankets, I continued my silent rebellion. Twitch. Pause. Curl. Release. I was gathering my strength for the war to come. Sunday night descended with agonizing slowness. The house grew quiet as midnight approached. I lay awake, my eyes fixed on the door, praying that Sarah had not been discovered or dismissed. At exactly 1 o'clock in the morning, the heavy oak doors clicked open. Sarah stepped inside carrying her usual medical supplies. Her face was pale and her eyes were darting nervously around the room. She locked the door behind her, a breach of Derek's strict protocol, and hurried toward my bed. She did not speak. She reached into the deep pocket of her medical scrubs and pulled out a folded sheaf of stiff white paper. Her hands trembled as she slid the document beneath the edge of my heavy blanket, positioning it near my right hand. She leaned in close, her breath warm against my ear. "It is worse than we thought," she whispered, her voice tight with suppressed fear. "I cannot read it to you aloud. They might have hidden microphones in here. You have to look at it yourself. I will stand by the door and keep watch." Sarah moved away, positioning herself as a sentinel between my bed and the hallway. I waited a full minute, listening to the rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor. Then, gathering every ounce of motor control I had reclaimed, I slowly moved my right hand under the blanket. My fingers brushed against the crisp paper. The effort to unfold the document was immense, sending sharp spikes of exhaustion up my arm. I flattened the pages against the mattress, using my thumb to push the blanket down, just enough to expose the text to the dim blue light. It was an official laboratory report, dense with medical jargon and chemical breakdowns. I forced my failing eyes to focus on the highlighted summary section at the bottom of the first page. The words leaped off the paper, burning themselves into my consciousness. The diagnosis was absolute. My blood contained massive lethal concentrations of thallium. It was highly toxic, tasteless, and odorless, notorious for causing rapid neurological degradation and systemic muscle paralysis. But the thallium was not alone. The report detailed the presence of an untraceable synthetic muscle relaxant designed to paralyze the respiratory system while masking the symptoms of traditional heavy metal poisoning. Dr. Aris had provided Derek with a sophisticated custom-built murder weapon. It was not a tragic degenerative disease. It was a calculated, agonizing assassination. They were dissolving my nervous system drop by drop, ensuring my death would look like a medical inevitability rather than a homicide. The sheer malice of the combination was breathtaking. I stared at the bold black letters spelling out my intended doom. The betrayal was complete. I let the blanket fall back over the report, hiding the deadly truth in the darkness. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. The despair that had choked me for months was gone, replaced by a crystalline Arctic rage. I knew the poison. I knew the method. And I now knew the enemy. I was no longer a victim waiting for the end. I was a dead man preparing to strike back. The silence of the room was broken only by the rhythmic hum of the oxygen concentrator. I lay in the dark, the horrifying truth of the toxicology report burning in my mind. The next night, Sarah returned for her shift. She moved with the same quiet, methodical efficiency, checking the heavy locks on the solid oak doors before approaching my bedside. She did not bring another piece of paper. Instead, she slipped her warm hand beneath the heavy cotton blankets and pressed a small, hard, rectangular object directly into my right palm. It was a cheap prepaid cellular phone. Against my paralyzed skin, it felt like a brick of solid gold. She leaned in very close, her breath grazing my ear. She whispered that the device was fully charged and completely untraceable. She paid for it in cash at an obscure convenience store to ensure no digital footprint connected it back to this house. She warned me that she had manually disabled the vibration settings and lowered the screen brightness to its absolute minimum level. She told me to keep it hidden deep within the mattress, padding beneath my right thigh, and to only pull it out when I was absolutely certain my son and his wife were asleep upstairs. She adjusted my intravenous lines, gave my shoulder a gentle squeeze of solidarity, and returned to her reading chair in the far corner. I was no longer completely cut off from the outside world. I finally had a lifeline. Using the phone was an agonizing, monumental ordeal. My right index finger and thumb were the only appendages I had successfully reclaimed from the chemical paralysis. Deep beneath the covers shielded from the blue light of the monitors, I fumbled blindly with the plastic buttons. Every single press required supreme concentration and exhausting physical exertion. My recovering muscles screamed in protest, trembling violently with the unfamiliar effort, but the icy rage coursing through my veins kept me moving. I needed to reach the one man in my corporate empire who possessed the cunning and the ruthlessness to dismantle Derek's master plan. Benjamin Thorne. Benjamin had been my primary legal counsel and closest confidant for 30 long years. He was a shark in a tailored suit, fiercely loyal, and absolutely uncorrupted by the greed that infected my son. Derek had always hated him. I slowly typed out his personal cellular number, a numerical sequence I had memorized decades ago during our first major hostile takeover. The small screen glowed with a faint, ghostly light against my chest. I opened a new blank text message. The physical act of typing out the words was excruciating. I made numerous frustrating mistakes, my weak thumb slipping awkwardly across the keys, forcing me to repeatedly delete and retype every other letter. It took me nearly 20 agonizing minutes to compose a single, terrifyingly brief message. I wrote my name referenced a classified real estate acquisition from the late 90s that only Benjamin and I knew about, and stated that I was being poisoned by my son. I stared at the glowing screen, my heart hammering violently against my ribs, and finally managed to press send. The response from my attorney did not come immediately. I lay in the suffocating darkness, clutching the small plastic device, terrified that Benjamin would dismiss the bizarre message as a cruel prank. 5 excruciating minutes passed, then 10. My breathing grew incredibly shallow with mounting anxiety. Finally, the screen illuminated the dark fabric resting against my chest. Benjamin responded. He demanded proof of my identity. He asked a highly specific question regarding the exact settlement figure of a complicated labor lawsuit we had quietly buried 15 years ago. My thumb hovered heavily over the tiny keypad. I painstakingly typed out the exact dollar amount right down to the final cent and hit send. The next message from Benjamin arrived within seconds. The sheer shock in his text was palpable, radiating even through the sterile digital screen. He wrote that Derek had officially informed the board of directors that I was incapacitated, suffering from profound dementia, and practically weeks away from inevitable death. I typed back as fast as my trembling finger would allow, explaining the thallium in the broth, the fake concierge doctor, the forcefully signed power of attorney, and the massive underground gambling debt I had overheard Derek discussing the night before. I explicitly told Benjamin that Derek was planning to execute a final lethal dose before the corporate auditors arrived on Monday morning. The digital silence that followed felt heavier and far more dangerous than before. When Benjamin finally replied, his words were sharp, concise, and filled with the familiar predatory edge I had relied on for 3 successful decades. He told me to stay perfectly still. He commanded me to play the part of a rotting corpse. He promised to quietly mobilize his entire legal team, secretly contact his allies in the federal authorities, and freeze the offshore transfers before Derek could complete the balloon payments to the cartel. We spent the next hour coordinating a silent, devastatingly precise counteroffensive. When morning finally broke, the true test of my physical endurance began. The night was my sanctuary of rebellion, but the day was a high-stakes theater of war. The heavy oak doors swung open, and Derek and Monica swept into the suite. I immediately let my facial muscles go slack. I widened my eyes into an unblinking stare, letting my jaw hang open slightly, in a display of pathetic weakness. I had to become a master of illusion, a living ghost trapped within my own failing flesh. Monica approached the bed with her tray, her face twisted in a flawless mask of performative concern. She ground the lethal white capsules into the porcelain bowl, the harsh scraping sound of the mortar and pestle echoing loudly in the quiet room. She brought the silver spoon to my lips. I opened my mouth willingly, accepting the bitter metallic poison. I let it pool in the deep pockets of my cheeks, fighting every natural instinct to gag or cough. Derek stood arrogantly at the foot of my bed, checking his diamond-encrusted platinum watch, complaining loudly to his wife about the frustratingly slow progress of the offshore wire transfers. He spoke about my impending death with the casual annoyance of a man waiting for a delayed commercial flight. "I am calling Aris," Derek grumbled, pacing the floorboards. "This is taking far too long. He needs to finish this today." He looked directly into my eyes, seeing absolutely nothing but a hollow, decaying shell. He did not see the terrible, cold fury burning brightly behind my vacant stare. He did not know that the small burner phone hidden securely beneath my thigh was silently receiving crucial updates from the most dangerous attorney in the city. I swallowed hard, expertly faking the ingestion of the toxic sludge while Monica wiped my chin with a crisp linen napkin. They genuinely thought they were the architects of my destruction. They had absolutely no idea they were standing in the center of a lethal trap I was meticulously building entirely around them. As the afternoon faded into another suffocating night, the house settled back into its deceptive quiet. Derek and Monica retreated to the upper floor, leaving me alone in the sterile darkness of the guest suite. The moment the digital clock shifted past midnight, I carefully extracted the burner phone from beneath my thigh. The faint glow of the screen illuminated my trembling fingers. I was exhausted, the thallium still ravaging my system, but the adrenaline of impending vengeance pushed me forward. Benjamin was waiting. Over the next 3 hours, my bedroom transformed into a covert command center. Benjamin possessed an unparalleled legal mind, and he had spent his entire career anticipating worst-case scenarios. He understood that my physical incapacitation meant traditional legal remedies were simply too slow. We needed a scorched earth strategy, an immediate and absolute financial severing. Through a series of highly encrypted messages, Benjamin laid out the framework of our counterstrike. The primary objective was to neutralize the power of attorney Derek was currently weaponizing, but simply revoking it would alert Derek to my sudden lucidity. We needed a maneuver that was entirely invisible until the exact moment it snapped shut. Benjamin proposed an irrevocable blind trust. It was a flawless, impenetrable legal fortress. By transferring my entire estate into this trust, I would technically strip myself of direct ownership, thereby instantly nullifying any authority Derek held through the power of attorney. The beauty of the mechanism was its absolute secrecy. The trust would be governed by a board of independent federal trustees, with Benjamin acting as the chief executor. Derek would continue to possess the physical pieces of paper he had forced me to sign, but legally, those documents would be reduced to worthless trash. Executing the transfer required my direct authorization. Benjamin utilized an emergency corporate protocol we had established decades ago for hostile takeover scenarios. He generated a series of highly secure digital authorization codes and forwarded them to my burner device. My right thumb hovered over the miniature keypad. Each keystroke was a physical battle against the heavy metallic numbness gripping my muscles. My vision swam with exhaustion, and my lungs ached with terribly shallow breaths. But with every single digit I confirmed, I felt a vital piece of my empire returning to my absolute control. I authorized the immediate transfer of my commercial real estate holdings, the downtown development contracts, and my vast portfolio of lucrative stock shares. Then came the liquid assets. $800 million in operational capital investment funds and personal reserves. With a final agonizing press of my thumb, I signed my digital signature. The confirmation message from Benjamin arrived instantly. The irrevocable blind trust was officially active. My life's work was now locked permanently behind an impenetrable wall of federal legal protection. Derek's power of attorney was legally void. Every single action he took from this moment forward was completely unauthorized, fraudulent, and entirely criminal. Yet, to the outside world, and far more importantly to Derek, absolutely nothing had changed. The banking interfaces he accessed daily would continue to display the exact same massive balances. The corporate portals would still readily accept his executive login credentials. Benjamin had intricately coordinated with the chief financial officer and our trusted institutional bankers to create a seamless, mirrored environment. Derek was now operating exclusively inside a digital ghost town. He was moving phantom money through elaborate shadow accounts, completely unaware that his stolen keys no longer opened any actual doors. The most critical phase of our covert operation involved the underground syndicate. If Derek successfully paid off his massive gambling debt, he might find a way to disappear before the corporate audit could expose his crimes. Benjamin knew we had to let Derek attempt the illicit transaction to secure the necessary federal charges, but we could not allow a single cent of my legitimate capital to reach a violent cartel. This is exactly where Benjamin's formidable connections proved truly invaluable. He had quietly reached out to his oldest contacts within the federal authorities, specifically the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI. Once they thoroughly reviewed the compelling evidence of Derek's offshore routing and the ongoing attempted murder, the federal agents moved with terrifying speed. They did not shut down the corporate transfer portal. Instead, they flawlessly compromised the receiving end of the digital pipeline. When Derek sat in my boardroom the next morning, arrogantly using my stolen authority to authorize the multi-million-dollar balloon payment, he fully believed he was saving his own life. He believed he was successfully routing illicit funds through a complicated labyrinth of shell companies directly into the Cayman Islands. He had absolutely no idea that the federal authorities had already intercepted the routing numbers. The massive wire transfers Derek initiated did not go to the ruthless syndicate. The money he confidently thought he was sending to clear his lethal debt bounced directly into a secure, heavily monitored FBI holding account. He was willingly handing the federal government a perfectly documented, undeniably clear map of his own extensive criminal enterprise. I lay in my mechanized bed throughout the entirety of the following day, perfectly still, quietly watching my son dig his own inescapable grave. Derek visited my room twice that Friday. He was visibly vibrating with a sickening, highly dangerous nervous energy. He paced back and forth across the carpet, checking his phone obsessively, anxiously, waiting for the confirmation that his monumental cartel debt was officially cleared. He wore that bespoke platinum watch with sickening pride, completely oblivious to the fact that his stolen time was rapidly running out. He looked down at me, his eyes gleaming with the arrogant, unearned satisfaction of a man who firmly believed he had just pulled off the perfect crime. He casually told me the downtown development project was moving forward smoothly, arrogantly, assuring me that he had personally handled the restless shareholders. He was actively signing voided contracts, making lucrative deals with phantom authority, and permanently sealing his own disastrous fate with every single arrogant signature. He genuinely believed that by Monday morning, the synthetic poison would finally finish its agonizing work, the corporate auditors would find absolutely nothing amiss, and he would seamlessly inherit a perfectly sanitized empire. He did not know that the syndicate was currently checking their offshore accounts and finding them entirely empty. He did not know that ruthless, violent men were slowly realizing they had been cheated by a desperate corporate heir. He did not know that the FBI was silently preparing a massive, inescapable indictment based entirely on his own careless financial footprints. And most importantly, he did not know that the paralyzed father he was slowly murdering was awake, incredibly lucid, and quietly watching his every single move. The weekend stretched before us like a taut wire waiting to snap. The corporate audit was scheduled for Monday morning. The poison was still flowing, and the cartel was waiting for their payment. I closed my eyes, letting the steady beep of the cardiac monitor mask the cold rhythm of my thoughts. The board was set. The pieces were locked in place. All I had to do was survive until Monday. The weekend began with a terrifying silence. I lay in my bed listening to the rhythmic hiss of my oxygen machine, knowing that every tick of the clock brought Derek closer to his breaking point. Benjamin had not been idle. The moment he received the digital authorization for the blind trust, he took the smuggled toxicology report directly to the federal authorities. He bypassed the local police entirely, marching straight into the regional headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Benjamin presented them with a flawless portfolio of absolute treason. He handed the senior agents the documented proof of massive offshore wire fraud, the intercepted routing numbers to the criminal cartel, and the undeniable medical evidence of chronic thallium poisoning. It was a complete, irrefutable package of attempted murder and corporate sabotage. The federal agents did not hesitate. They recognized the sheer scale of the syndicate involvement and immediately escalated the situation to a high-priority domestic terrorism task force. They needed absolute airtight surveillance of my bedroom to capture Derek in the act of administering the final lethal dose of the synthetic muscle relaxant. They needed eyes inside the walls of his impenetrable fortress. The execution of their plan was a masterpiece of bureaucratic infiltration. On Saturday afternoon, the heavy oak doors of my suite swung open to reveal a stranger. He wore a crisp white medical uniform, a lanyard with a laminated hospital identification badge, and carried a heavy metallic equipment case. Derek stood nervously in the doorway, his eyes darting suspiciously over the man. The stranger introduced himself as a senior respiratory therapist dispatched directly by the insurance company. He spoke with a bored, clinical monotone, explaining that my primary oxygen concentrator was flagging a potential pressure malfunction in their remote monitoring system. He stated that federal healthcare regulations required an immediate mandatory recalibration of the device to prevent fatal oxygen deprivation. It was a brilliant, flawlessly delivered excuse. Derek was visibly annoyed, but he was trapped by the very medical narrative he had fabricated to hide my murder. He could not deny a mandated respiratory check without instantly raising profound suspicions with the insurance agency. He reluctantly stepped aside, allowing the technician to enter the room. Derek lingered for a moment, checking his expensive watch, before the magnetic pull of his anxiety dragged him away. He muttered something about needing a drink and headed downstairs to the main living area, leaving the door slightly cracked. The moment Derek's footsteps faded down the long, carpeted hallway, the bored respiratory therapist underwent a startling transformation. His posture straightened. His movements became incredibly sharp, precise, and completely silent. He was not a medical professional. He was a highly trained technical operative for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He walked swiftly over to my bed, giving me a single confirming nod. He knew I was awake. He knew I was fighting a war from my mattress. I blinked once, acknowledging the silent alliance. He immediately went to work. He unlatched his heavy metallic equipment case, completely bypassing the oxygen concentrator. Instead, he pulled out a series of tiny, incredibly sophisticated digital components. He moved to the center of the room, dragging a small step stool directly beneath the ceiling-mounted smoke detector. With practiced efficiency, he unscrewed the plastic casing. He wired a microscopic high-definition camera lens directly into the existing electrical grid of the alarm system, ensuring the device would never run out of battery power. It took him exactly 2 minutes. He did not stop there. The federal operative moved seamlessly across the room, his eyes scanning the space for the optimal tactical angles. He approached the large mahogany dresser where Monica always prepared my poisoned broth. Resting on top of the dresser was an ornate silver picture frame holding a photograph of Derek and me from better days. The irony was physically nauseating. The technician deftly removed the back panel of the frame. He embedded a second pinhole-sized camera directly into the dark filigree bordering the glass. This lens was perfectly angled to capture a flawless, undeniable view of the mortar, the pestle, and the exact moment Monica crushed the lethal white capsules. He worked with a calm, surgical precision, his hands moving flawlessly in the quiet room. Every modification was entirely invisible to the naked eye. He then pulled a small digital receiver from his pocket, verifying the encrypted wireless transmission. The microscopic cameras were broadcasting a crystal-clear, high-definition video feed directly to an armored federal surveillance van parked 3 blocks away. A team of federal agents was now watching my bedroom. They had a front-row seat to my impending execution. With his covert mission accomplished, the operative snapped the cover back onto his equipment case. He walked over to my oxygen concentrator and pushed a few random buttons to justify his presence. He leaned over my bed, adjusting my nasal cannula with gentle professional care. He leaned incredibly close, his voice dropping to a harsh, barely audible whisper. "We have the feed, Mr. Caldwell," he breathed into my ear. "You are completely covered. My team is monitoring this room around the clock. Do not break character. No matter what they say, no matter what they do, you must let them proceed with their plan. We need them to attempt the administration of the final dose. The moment they cross that line, we will breach the house and take them down. Stay strong. We are right here with you." He patted my shoulder, picked up his heavy metallic case, and walked out, closing the doors behind him with a thud. I was left entirely alone, but the terrifying weight of isolation was entirely gone. The room was no longer a silent tomb. It was a brightly lit stage. The trap was officially primed. Every single shadow in the room was now armed with the watchful eyes of the federal government. When Derek returned an hour later, his breath smelling heavily of aged scotch, he had absolutely no idea he was walking onto a meticulously monitored movie set. He paced the floorboards, cursing his offshore bankers, completely oblivious to the high-definition lens tracking his every single movement from the smoke detector above his head. When Monica brought my dinner later that evening, she crushed the toxic capsules into my broth, while the picture frame silently broadcast her crime to a dozen federal witnesses. I lay perfectly still, playing my part with a cold, terrifying precision. I accepted the poisoned liquid, faked the swallow, and secretly spit the metallic sludge onto the dark carpet the moment she looked away. I was no longer a helpless victim drowning in a sea of betrayal. I was the bait in a highly sophisticated federal snare. The agonizing hours of the long weekend slowly ticked by each second, bringing us closer to the end. I waited in the dark, gathering my silent rage, absolutely ready to watch my treacherous son walk directly into the jaws of his own inescapable destruction. It was only a matter of time before the final act of this twisted play commenced. I would be awake for every single moment of it. Monday morning dawned with the bleak gray light of an impending storm. The central air conditioning hummed its familiar tune, completely oblivious to the lethal tension saturating the estate. I lay perfectly motionless in the center of the sprawling medical bed, my eyes half closed in a convincing imitation of a man hovering on the absolute brink of death. Above me, tucked invisibly behind the slotted plastic of the smoke detector, the federal authorities were watching. Every ragged breath I took, every frantic step my son paced across the hardwood floor was being recorded in pristine high definition. The trap was holding its breath, waiting for the prey to step onto the trigger. Derek strode into the suite shortly after 8. He did not look at me. His entire focus was consumed by the sleek silver laptop he carried under his arm. His face was a mask of strained concentration, heavily lined with exhaustion and the sickening grease of a massive hangover. The corporate auditors were scheduled to begin their exhaustive review of the firm's ledgers in exactly 2 hours. This was his final window. He placed the computer on the glass coffee table, opened the secure banking application, and began typing with rapid, aggressive keystrokes. He was preparing to wire the final $10 million to the underground syndicate. He was attempting to buy his life back using the empire I had built. I listened to the sharp, percussive clicks of the keyboard. Then the typing abruptly stopped. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the room. Derek hit a single key. He waited. He hit it again, harder this time. A low, guttural curse escaped his lips. He slammed his hand against the glass table, rattling the decorative vases. The digital transfer had failed. I knew exactly what his screen displayed. A stark, uncompromising, red error message. Access globally denied. He snatched his cellular phone from his pocket and frantically dialed his offshore private banker, his fingers trembling so violently he nearly dropped the device. "What is going on with the primary accounts?" Derek hissed into the receiver, pacing furiously in front of the hidden camera embedded in the picture frame. "I am trying to authorize the secondary wire transfer, and the system is rejecting my credentials. Fix it immediately." The voice on the other end of the line was faint, but Derek's reaction painted a vivid picture of absolute devastation. The banker was informing him of the terrifying new reality. The power of attorney he had wielded with such arrogance was now completely worthless. The accounts were locked. The capital was untouchable. "What do you mean, a superior trust mechanism?" Derek practically screamed, his voice cracking with rising panic. I am the active proxy. I have the legal authority. You are looking at the documents." He paced faster, a caged animal, realizing the bars were closing in. "Override it. I am giving you a direct executive order to override the block and push the transfer through." He listened for another agonizing 10 seconds before the color completely vanished from his face, leaving him looking like a polished corpse. The banker had hung up. Derek slowly lowered the phone. The reality of his situation crashed down upon him with the destructive force of an avalanche. He was completely locked out. The empire was sealed. The money he desperately needed to survive was sitting behind an impenetrable wall of federal legal protection. and the corporate auditors were currently pulling into the company parking lot across the city. They were going to find the massive glaring holes in the ledgers. They were going to find the missing millions. He was entirely out of time, and he was completely out of options. His breathing grew shallow and erratic. He gripped the edge of the mahogany dresser, his knuckles turning a stark, translucent white. He pulled up a hidden encrypted application on his phone and initiated a secure call. This was not the banker. This was the syndicate. The men who did not care about corporate audits or trust mechanisms. They only cared about their missing payment. "Listen to me," Derek begged the moment the call connected, his arrogant facade entirely stripped away, replaced by the pathetic whimper of a terrified child. "I need a small extension. There has been a temporary technical glitch with the primary corporate accounts. The funds are there, I just need a few more days to clear a legal hurdle." The response from the cartel operative was swift and utterly merciless. Derek's eyes widened in sheer unadulterated terror. He began to hyperventilate. "Please, you have to understand the audit is today. I cannot move the money right now. I just need a little more time." He listened again, his body physically shrinking inward. The syndicate had delivered their final ultimatum. He had exactly 24 hours to clear the $10 million debt, or they were going to hunt him down and butcher him in the streets. The call disconnected. Derek dropped the phone onto the carpet. He buried his face in his hands, releasing a ragged, pathetic sob. The heavy oak doors clicked open, and Monica glided into the room, carrying the morning tray of poisoned broth. She stopped in her tracks, her perfectly painted features twisting in confusion as she took in the sight of her husband unraveling on the floor. "Derek," she asked, her voice sharp with immediate concern. "What is wrong? Did the wire go through?" Derek slowly lifted his head. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely feral. He looked like a man staring directly into the open jaws of hell. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing Monica by the shoulders, his fingers digging bruisingly into her expensive silk blouse. "The accounts are frozen," he whispered, his voice trembling with absolute panic. "The bank is rejecting the power of attorney. They are claiming some kind of blind trust has overridden my authority. I cannot move a single cent, Monica. The money is locked." Monica gasped, dropping the silver spoon onto the tray with a loud clatter. "What do you mean, locked?" "The auditors are coming today. If you do not balance the books, we are going to federal prison. And the cartel, Derek, the cartel." Derek shook her gently, his eyes blazing with a dark, terrifying desperation. "The cartel gave me 24 hours, he hissed, glancing around the room, with paranoid intensity, completely unaware of the federal lenses capturing his every word. 24 hours before they send a collection team to this house. We are dead, Monica. We are both dead." Monica stared at him, her chest heaving with terror. "What do we do?" she whispered. "How do we get the money?" Derek looked past her, his gaze locking onto my motionless body lying in the center of the bed. A cold, ruthless calculation settled over his panicked features. He released Monica's shoulders and stepped toward the foot of my mattress. He believed that my death was the only remaining key. He thought my murder would freeze the audit. He turned back to his wife. "We have to speed it up. The old man has to die tonight, so the inheritance triggers." The chilling finality of his words hung in the sterile air. He turned and stormed out, leaving Monica trembling in the room. She stared at my motionless body before turning and fleeing after her husband. The heavy oak doors clicked shut. I lay in the dim light, the hum of the oxygen concentrator grounding my racing thoughts. The deadly timeline had violently accelerated. Derek was no longer waiting for the slow degradation of the thallium. The syndicate had backed him into a corner, and his desperation was about to manifest into direct lethal action. I absolutely knew what was coming. I had spent the last 48 hours preparing for this exact confrontation, silently coordinating with Benjamin and the federal operatives monitoring the hidden feeds. The invisible snare was perfectly set, but the bait still had to endure the strike. The digital clock on the nightstand shifted, glowing a harsh crimson in the darkened room. It was exactly 2 in the morning. The silence of the house was absolute, thick with the suffocating anticipation of a looming execution. Then the heavy brass latch of the oak doors clicked. The sound was unnaturally loud in the quiet space. The doors swung open slowly, revealing the long shadows of 2 men stepping into the suite. Derek walked in first, wearing dark, nondescript clothing. His face was pale and slick with a cold sweat. He moved with frantic energy, glancing nervously at the locked windows. Behind him stepped a man I had never seen before. This was not Dr. Eris. This was the cleaner Derek had requested a phantom brought in to expedite a murder. The stranger was remarkably unremarkable, wearing sterile medical scrubs that mirrored the agency nurses. He carried a black leather medical bag, moving with a chilling, practiced efficiency, devoid of any hesitation. This man was a professional instrument of death. They approached the right side of my medical bed, standing directly beneath the smoke detector housing the federal camera lens. I maintained my absolute paralysis. I slowed my breathing until my chest barely moved, keeping my eyes fixed in a vacant, unblinking stare toward the ceiling. The stranger placed his black leather bag onto the mahogany bedside table. He unzipped the main compartment with a soft metallic scrape. Derek stood rigidly beside him, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his gaze darting between the medical equipment and my face. "Is it ready?" Derek asked, his voice a harsh, desperate whisper. The stranger did not immediately answer. He reached into the dark bag and withdrew a sterile, plastic-wrapped syringe. He then pulled out a small, clear glass vial containing a colorless liquid. "Potassium chloride," the man stated, his tone flat and entirely clinical. "It is the cleanest method available. The concentrated dose will immediately induce a massive, catastrophic myocardial infarction. It effectively overloads the electrical impulses of the heart, causing it to seize and stop entirely. By the time the coroner runs the standard autopsy, the chemical will have naturally dissipated into the surrounding cellular tissue. It is completely untraceable. They will rule it a sudden, tragic cardiac event resulting from his ongoing neurological decline. There will be no questions, no investigations, and no complications." The cleaner tapped the side of the glass vial with his index finger, a sharp, rhythmic clicking that echoed in the quiet room. He plunged the needle through the rubber stopper and slowly drew back the plunger, filling the plastic cylinder with the lethal, untraceable poison. He flicked the syringe twice, clearing a tiny air bubble from the tip. A single drop of the clear liquid beaded at the end of the needle, catching the faint blue light of the cardiac monitor. He turned to the intravenous line taped securely to the back of my right hand, preparing to inject the fatal dose directly into my bloodstream. "Wait," Derek commanded, suddenly raising a trembling hand. "Give me a minute. I need a minute with him." The cleaner paused, his expression indifferent. He lowered the syringe slightly, stepping back to give my son the space he demanded. Derek leaned over the metal bedrail. His face was inches from mine. The scent of stale scotch and raw fear radiated from his pores. He stared deeply into my eyes, searching for a flicker of recognition, a spark of life behind the vacant, paralyzed mask. He found nothing. I was a monument of stone. Derek dropped the facade of the grieving, loving son completely. The polite, respectful mask he had worn for 30 years shattered, revealing the toxic, festering resentment rotting underneath. "You did this, you know," Derek whispered, his voice dripping with venom and a twisted, pathetic sense of justification. "You brought this entirely on yourself, old man. You and your endless, suffocating expectations." He gripped the steel bedrail, his knuckles turning white with suppressed fury. "I spent my entire life standing in your massive shadow. Do you have any idea what that feels like, to be Harrison Caldwell's son? You were a titan, a legend, a self-made empire builder who never stopped working. You built a fortune from nothing, and you made sure everyone around you knew it. You demanded perfection. You expected me to just fall in line, to be another obedient gear in your massive corporate machine. But nothing I did was ever good enough for you. Nothing was ever fast enough, smart enough, or ruthless enough. Derek leaned in closer, his breath hot against my cheek. You made me feel incredibly small. Every single time you looked at me in the boardroom, every time you subtly questioned my leadership, you were stripping away my dignity. You thought you were teaching me how to lead, but all you did was show me that I would never, ever be you. You made me hate the legacy you were trying to hand me. I lay perfectly still, absorbing the toxic spill of his deepest insecurities. He was entirely blind to his own catastrophic failures, choosing instead to blame my work ethic for his crippling gambling addiction and staggering incompetence. I found my own way to win. Derek continued, a bitter, arrogant smile twisting his lips. I found a way to take the power you refused to hand over. But you just would not die. You had to linger here, stubborn and arrogant to the bitter end. The auditors are coming tomorrow, Dad. The syndicate is threatening to butcher me. I am out of time, and it is all your fault. If you had just died when Aris poisoned you, I could have walked away clean. But you forced my hand. He reached out and patted my cheek, a sickening mockery of paternal affection. Goodbye, Dad. Derek straightened his posture, stepping back from the bed. He turned toward the silent cleaner. Do it, Derek ordered, his voice cold. Finish it right now. The cleaner stepped forward, raising the syringe. He reached for the intravenous port on my hand. The fatal strike was seconds away. But as he moved, the silence was shattered by the deafening crash of the heavy oak doors being violently kicked completely open by federal agents rushing inside the sterile guest room. The needle was a millimeter from the intravenous port. The deadly clear liquid caught the faint ambient light, a single drop hovering at the very tip of the steel point. Derek leaned down, his face entirely devoid of humanity, dropping the last remnants of his loving son facade. He spit out his final venomous words, his breath hot against my cheek. Goodbye, old man. Those words were meant to be the period at the end of my life, the final closing statement of a quiet execution. Instead, they were the exact trigger for his absolute destruction. Suddenly, my eyes snapped wide open. The vacant, cloudy stare of a dying vegetable vanished instantly, replaced by a blazing, furious clarity. For weeks, I had been hoarding my strength, secretly spitting out the paralyzing toxins and reclaiming my neurological autonomy millimeter by millimeter. My right hand, completely restored and fueled by an ocean of cold rage, shot upward from beneath the heavy cotton blankets. I did not move like a sick man. I moved like a predator, perfectly executing an ambush. I clamped my fingers around Derek's wrist with the terrifying bone-crushing grip of a man who had spent his entire life destroying ruthless competitors. Derek let out a shrill, piercing scream of pure, unadulterated horror. His eyes bulged in their sockets, his face contorting into a mask of absolute disbelief as the impossible happened right in front of him. The dead man was fighting back. The sheer force of my grip ground the delicate bones of his wrist together. The pain was immediate and blinding. His fingers involuntarily spasmed, opening wide. The sterile syringe slipped from his grasp, bouncing harmlessly onto the thick carpet. It rolled under the mahogany nightstand, the deadly potassium chloride completely neutralized. Derek tried to yank his arm away, stumbling backward in a frantic panic, but I held on with an iron vise. I anchored my elbow against the mattress, using my entire body weight to keep him trapped exactly where he was. Trent, the cold and clinical cleaner, realized the assassination had failed catastrophically. The illusion of a peaceful passing was shattered. He stumbled backward, his clinical demeanor instantly evaporating. He reached frantically inside his dark jacket, his fingers fumbling for the cold steel of a suppressed pistol hidden in his shoulder holster. He was shifting from stealth to loud violence, prepared to shoot his way out of the compromised situation. But the silence had already been shattered by the deafening crash of the heavy oak doors being violently kicked completely open. A tactical squad of federal agents flooded into the sterile guest room, their movements fluid, rapid, and overwhelmingly aggressive. Blinding tactical flashlights pierced the dim blue glow of the medical monitors, painting the walls with harsh white beams. Voices boomed with absolute authority, echoing off the high ceilings. Federal agents, drop your weapons. Get on the ground right now. Trent froze, his hand still buried inside his jacket. A massive tactical operative tackled him, driving him forcefully into the mahogany dresser. The ornate silver picture frame holding the hidden camera that had documented everything crashed to the floor. Trent hit the ground hard, the breath driven out of his lungs. Two more agents instantly pinned his arms behind his back, securing thick plastic restraints around his wrists. The suppressed pistol clattered uselessly across the hardwood floor, kicked away by a heavy combat boot. The deadly professional had been neutralized in less than 5 seconds. The room was a chaotic symphony of shouted commands, heavy footsteps, and the crackle of federal police radios. The trap had snapped shut with flawless precision. I finally released my crushing hold on my son. Derek collapsed onto the floor beside my bed, grabbing his bruised wrist, his chest heaving with frantic, ragged breaths. He looked up at me from the carpet, his expression a chaotic mixture of physical pain and profound psychological devastation. The cognitive dissonance was breaking his mind. He could not comprehend that the paralyzed father he had been casually poisoning for months was sitting up, breathing steadily, and watching him with absolute contempt. I slowly pushed the heavy blankets aside and swung my legs over the edge of the mattress. My muscles ached, but the adrenaline flowing through my system provided all the strength I required. I looked down at the pathetic creature cowering on the floor. I spoke my very first words to him in over a season. My voice was raspy from disuse, but it carried the heavy, unmistakable weight of absolute authority. You wanted my empire, Derek. But you were always too weak, too impatient, and far too stupid to understand what it actually takes to build one. You thought you were a wolf, but you are nothing more than a desperate, cornered rat. Derek scrambled backward, hitting the nightstand. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The realization of his complete failure was suffocating him. He slowly turned his head, taking in the tactical agents securing the room, the discarded syringe on the carpet, and the grim reality that his every move had been meticulously anticipated. Out in the carpeted hallway, a woman screaming pierced the air. Monica had burst from the master suite, alerted by the violent commotion. I heard the sharp, commanding voices of the federal agents intercepting her. There was a brief struggle, the sound of a scuffle against the wall, and then the distinct metallic click of handcuffs snapping into place. Monica began to sob hysterically, crying out for Derek, pleading with the men to let her go. Her performative grief was finally real, born not of a tragic loss, but of the sudden catastrophic destruction of her luxurious lifestyle. She was going to federal prison, and she knew it. The syndicate would not get their money, the auditors would find the truth, and the glamorous life she had plotted to steal was completely gone. Benjamin Thorne stepped through the doorway wearing a sharp midnight blue suit that contrasted deeply with the tactical gear of the federal operatives. He adjusted his glasses, his face a mask of vindicated satisfaction. He looked at Derek trembling on the floor, and then he looked at me, giving a slow, respectful nod. The blind trust maneuver had worked flawlessly. Every single transaction Derek had attempted throughout the day had bounced harmlessly into federal holding accounts. The digital snare had caught every single piece of evidence required to bury my son under a mountain of wire fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder charges. Benjamin walked over to the bed, entirely ignoring Derek. "It is done, Harrison," Benjamin stated clearly, ensuring his voice carried across the room. "The accounts are permanently locked. The cartel wire transfers were intercepted by the Bureau. The power of attorney has been officially flagged as fraudulent. You are completely secure, and they have absolutely nothing." Derek buried his face in his hands, releasing a long, agonizing moan of pure defeat. The empire he thought he stole was a mirage. I stood up from the bed, feeling the floor beneath my feet for the first time in months. The long, brutal war was finally over. I had won. The long, brutal war was finally over. I had won. But the final execution of my ultimate victory required absolute precision. As Trent stumbled backward toward the mahogany dresser, his hand frantically fumbling inside his dark jacket for his suppressed pistol, The grand trap I had meticulously set finally snapped completely shut. Before Trent could even raise the weapon to fire a single shot, the reinforced glass of the large master suite shattered violently inward. A deafening explosion of sound and shattered glass ripped through the sterile darkness of my bedroom. At that exact same fraction of a second, the heavy oak doors leading to the main hallway were kicked entirely off their solid brass hinges. The expensive wood splintered into massive jagged shards that scattered across the premium carpet. A full federal tactical team flooded the confined space. They moved with terrifying speed and overwhelming physical force, shouting strict authoritative commands that vibrated deeply within my chest. These elite agents had been watching the entire attempted murder broadcast live from the armored surveillance van parked quietly outside the estate gates. They knew exactly what was happening, and they knew exactly who was guilty. Intense red laser sights immediately painted Trent across his chest and forehead. The tactical operatives swarmed the professional cleaner before he could even pull the lethal firearm from his leather shoulder holster. He was slammed brutally against the custom wallpaper and instantly dragged heavily to the floor. His cold, clinical composure was utterly destroyed in a single violent instant as thick plastic restraints were secured tightly around his wrists. Derek spun around wildly, completely paralyzed by the sudden, overwhelming chaos filling the room. He let out a pathetic, shrill shriek of pure confusion as two heavily armored federal agents tackled him straight to the polished hardwood floor. His knees hit the ground incredibly hard, and his arrogant face was pressed firmly into the carpet by a gloved hand. He screamed frantically, demanding to know exactly what was happening, desperately begging for someone to explain the terrifying nightmare rapidly unfolding all around him. He thrashed his legs and twisted his shoulders, completely unable to comprehend the massive federal presence invading his perfect crime scene. I did not wait for the dust to settle or for the shouting to stop. I slowly and calmly sat upright in the center of the complex medical bed. The paralyzing neurological numbness that had imprisoned me for months was now nothing more than a distant, fading memory. I reached over with my restored right hand and firmly grabbed the clear plastic tubing of the intravenous line taped securely to my left arm. With one smooth, deliberate motion, I ripped the medical needle directly out of my vein. A tiny drop of dark blood beaded on my skin, but I completely ignored the minor sting. I swung my legs over the edge of the thick mattress and planted my bare feet firmly onto the cold floor. The room fell into a sudden, stunned silence as the federal agents quickly secured the room perimeters and looked respectfully toward me. They recognized me as the architect of this entire operation. Derek stopped thrashing against the strong agents, restraining his arms behind his back. He twisted his neck awkwardly, looking up at me from the floor. All the remaining color drained completely from his panicked face. His eyes were wide with a profound terror that went far beyond the reality of the federal raid. He was staring at me as if he were watching a dead man rise from a sealed grave. He stammered my name twice, his voice nothing more than a broken, pathetic whisper of absolute disbelief. His mind simply could not process the impossible sight of his paralyzed father, sitting upright, breathing easily, and staring down at him with an expression of pure, calculating dominance. I looked down at my treacherous son, feeling absolutely no pity, no sorrow, and no regret whatsoever. I had given this boy the entire world, and he had cowardly tried to bury me in the dark, simply to cover a massive illicit gambling debt. I slowly stood tall, letting the full crushing weight of my completely restored corporate and paternal authority fill the sterile bedroom. I looked directly straight into his panicked, tearful eyes. "You always were terrible at due diligence, Derek." The words hung heavily in the tense air of the bedroom. Derek stared up at me with his mouth completely open, his brain entirely broken by the devastating reality of his failure. The federal agents hauled him roughly to his feet, ignoring his pathetic whimpering. I slowly walked across the room, feeling the strength returning to my legs with every single confident step. I stopped directly in front of him. I wanted him to see the complete clarity in my eyes. I wanted him to fully understand that I had been awake for weeks. I had heard every single cruel joke he made with his wife. I had listened to every desperate phone call he placed to his offshore bankers. I had meticulously documented every single fraudulent wire transfer he initiated using my stolen authority. "You thought you could simply erase me," I said, my voice steady and cold. "You thought you could casually steal an empire that I spent 4 decades building with my own bare hands, but you never possessed the intelligence or the discipline to actually run it. You were merely a greedy parasite feeding on my success, and the moment things became difficult, you immediately turned to murder." Derek began to sob openly, heavy tears streaming down his face as the cold reality of his bleak future crashed down upon him. He begged me to stop the agents pleading for a second chance, promising that he would make everything right if I just ordered them to let him go. I simply shook my head in utter disgust. "The blind trust I established with Benjamin has already locked away every single asset you thought you controlled," I informed him calmly. "The federal authorities have already seized the phantom funds you attempted to wire to your criminal associates. You have absolutely nothing left, Derek. No money, no power, no legacy, and absolutely no family. You are completely, entirely alone." The agents began to drag him toward the shattered doorway. He fought weakly against their grip, twisting his head to look back at me one final time. His eyes were completely hollow, stripped of all the unearned arrogance he had paraded around the estate for months. I watched him disappear down the long hallway, listening to his frantic sobbing fade into the distance. The tactical operatives quickly cleared the room, removing the neutralized cleaner and securing the lethal syringe as crucial physical evidence for the upcoming criminal trial. Derek and his hired assassin would spend the rest of their pathetic lives locked securely away inside a cold federal prison cell. I stood entirely alone in the center of the quiet suite, breathing deeply for the very first time in what felt like an eternity. The dangerous game was officially over. I had successfully reclaimed my stolen life, my massive corporate empire, and my absolute freedom. "You always were terrible at due diligence, Derek," I said, my voice cutting through the chaotic shouting of the federal agents. The words struck my son with the physical force of a sledgehammer. He was pinned against the polished hardwood floor, his cheek crushed into the carpet by the heavy combat boot of a tactical operative. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, stared up at me in absolute mind-breaking horror. He could not comprehend what he was seeing. The helpless, paralyzed father he had systematically poisoned for months was suddenly sitting completely upright. The intravenous line discarded his voice, steady and radiating absolute authority. The professional cleaner Trent was already dragged to his feet, his hands securely bound behind his back with thick plastic zip ties, his lethal syringe locked away as pristine evidence. The sterile guest room was completely swamped by the overwhelming presence of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, their flashlights cutting through the dim medical lighting. Derek opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic, suffocated gasp escaped his throat. The reality of his catastrophic failure was violently breaking his mind into pieces. Before Derek could even attempt to form a coherent sentence, the frantic sound of high heels clicking rapidly against the hallway hardwood echoed toward us. Monica burst through the shattered remains of the heavy oak doors. She stopped dead in her tracks, her manicured hands flying to her face as she took in the terrifying scene. She saw the elite federal agents securing the perimeters. She saw the professional assassin pressed against the mahogany dresser. She saw her husband cowering on the floor in heavy steel handcuffs. And finally, her gaze locked onto me, sitting comfortably on the edge of the medical bed, entirely alive and perfectly aware. In less than a second, her calculating brain processed the absolute destruction of her glamorous lifestyle. Monica did what she always did when cornered. She immediately began a flawless theatrical performance. She dropped to her knees, crocodile tears instantly flooding her perfectly painted face. She began to sob hysterically, her voice trembling with manufactured terror and false innocence. "Oh my God!" Monica cried out, reaching a trembling hand toward the closest federal agent. "Thank God you are here. He is crazy. Derek has lost his mind. I had absolutely no idea what he was planning to do. She pointed a manicured finger directly at her husband, throwing him to the wolves without a single moment of hesitation. He forced me to stay silent. He threatened my life. I did not know anything about a hitman or the poison. You have to believe me, I am a victim here. Derek stared at his wife, his jaw dropping in stunned betrayal. The woman who had ruthlessly plotted my demise alongside him was now casually discarding him to save her own skin. The federal operatives did not move. They stood like statues watching the pathetic display with cold, professional indifference. I remained seated on the edge of the mattress, letting her performative sobbing fill the quiet spaces of the room. I allowed her to spin her desperate web of lies for a full minute before I decided to finally end her miserable charade. I reached over to the bedside table and picked up a small black digital recorder Benjamin Thorne had left for me. It was directly synchronized with the encrypted federal surveillance feed that had been monitoring every single whisper in this house. I pressed a single silver button. The crystal-clear, undeniably sharp audio recording cut through Monica's fake weeping like a sharp blade. It was her own voice captured just 24 hours prior, standing in this exact room. "Is the dosage strong enough this time, Derek?" her recorded voice asked, dripping with cold, calculated malice. "We cannot afford another delay. The old man needs to be gone before the auditors arrive. Make sure the mixture is lethal." The recording stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy, and absolutely final. Monica's theatrical sobbing ceased instantly, her face drained of all color, transforming into a pale, terrifying mask of profound realization. The undeniable proof of her active, malicious complicity had just been broadcast to a room full of federal witnesses. Her lips trembled, but her silver tongue could not formulate a single defensive lie. A female federal agent stepped forward, her expression completely devoid of sympathy. She grabbed Monica by the arm, hauling her roughly to her feet. The cold metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping tightly around her wrists echoed loudly in the room. Monica did not fight back. The devastating weight of her reality crushed the last ounce of fight out of her. I slowly stood up from the medical bed, my bare feet planting firmly onto the floor. I walked past the terrified woman and stepped directly over to where my son was kneeling in his restraints. Derek was weeping openly, now pathetic, heavy tears of a man who realized he had lost absolutely everything. He looked up at me, his face smeared with sweat, and the bitter realization of his own pathetic inadequacy. He tried to speak, to beg for a mercy he never once considered showing me. "Dad, please," he whimpered, his voice cracking horribly. "I was desperate. I made a terrible mistake. Please, you have to help me." I looked down at the miserable creature kneeling on my carpet. I felt absolutely no pity, no sorrow, and no regret. I reached into the pocket of my silk robe and pulled out a crisp, heavy piece of parchment. It was the finalized, federally authenticated documentation for the blind trust Benjamin had executed. I crouched down slightly, holding the stiff paper directly in front of his tear-soaked face so he could clearly read the bold, unyielding legal terms. "There will be no help, Derek," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute, unforgiving finality. "This is the superior trust mechanism that blocked your pathetic wire transfers. This document strips you of every single corporate title, every financial access code, and every ounce of authority you ever possessed." I let the paper flutter gently to the floor, landing directly next to his shackled hands. I leaned in close, ensuring my final words would haunt him for the rest of his miserable life. "You do not get the company. You do not get the house. You do not get a single dime of the empire I built. You get exactly 25 years in a federal lockup." I stood tall, turning my back on him forever. The agents hauled Derek and Monica away, dragging them out of the suite completely stripped of their wealth, their dignity, and their freedom. I stood alone in the quiet room, listening to their desperate wails echo down the long corridor until they finally vanished entirely. The dangerous war was officially over. The stifling shadows that had poisoned my home were permanently banished. I breathed in the cool air, savoring the profound taste of absolute victory. I was entirely ready to step out of the darkness, reclaim the massive corporate empire they foolishly tried to steal, and begin living my newly restored life on my own unyielding terms. Exactly 6 months have passed since that terrifying night, when my own flesh and blood attempted to snuff out my existence. I now stand in the center of the sprawling executive boardroom of my corporate headquarters, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows at the breathtaking Seattle skyline. The towering steel structures pierce the low-hanging slate-gray clouds, mirroring the cold, unyielding resilience I had to forge within my own soul. The rain streaks down the thick glass, washing away the grime of the city, just as I had washed away the toxic rot that had silently infected my life. I am leaning slightly on a custom silver-tipped cane, a lingering physical reminder of the neurological damage the thallium inflicted upon my nervous system. However, my posture is entirely upright, my shoulders are squared, and my stance is completely unyielding. I am no longer the helpless, paralyzed victim confined to a hidden medical bed, waiting for the slow, agonizing descent into oblivion. I am the absolute master of my domain once again. The transition from that silent, suffocating tomb in my estate to this pinnacle of corporate power was arduous, demanding months of grueling physical therapy and relentless mental conditioning. But every single painful step I took was fueled by the burning necessity to reclaim the life that had been so viciously stolen from me. My return to the helm of the Caldwell Empire was not merely a transition of power. It was a swift, ruthless, and absolute corporate purge. In the immediate aftermath of Derek's very public arrest, I initiated a forensic audit of every single department, subsidiary, and offshore holding connected to our massive portfolio. I personally dismantled the elaborate network of shell companies and shadow accounts my son had constructed to facilitate his pathetic money laundering scheme with the criminal syndicate. I did not stop with Derek. I systematically eradicated every executive, every spineless board member, and every corrupt manager who had blindly enabled his disastrous tenure or conveniently looked the other way while he plundered our resources. They were abruptly fired, their lucrative severance packages entirely revoked, and their professional reputations permanently destroyed. I replaced them with a new generation of fiercely loyal, incredibly sharp, and utterly uncompromising leaders who understood the true value of relentless diligence. The company was scrubbed clean of Derek's toxic, arrogant influence. The remaining rot was completely excised, leaving behind a corporate structure that was undeniably leaner, remarkably stronger, and infinitely more formidable than it had ever been before. I had built this vast empire from nothing, and I was deeply committed to ensuring that it would never again be threatened by the careless hands of an entitled parasite. The heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open, interrupting my quiet reflection. Benjamin Thorne stepped into the expansive room carrying a thick leather folio tucked securely under his right arm. He wore a sharp charcoal suit, his expression radiating a calm, deeply satisfied professionalism. Benjamin had proven to be much more than a brilliant corporate attorney. He had been the solitary anchor holding my life together when I was drowning in a sea of absolute betrayal. He walked across the polished floor and placed the leather folio directly onto the center of the massive mahogany conference table. He opened it, revealing a thick stack of legally binding financial documents. I approached the table, resting both of my hands on the smooth wood as I reviewed the final contractual stipulations. This was the ultimate realization of a promise I had made to myself while lying paralyzed in the dark. With a smooth, deliberate motion, I picked up a heavy gold fountain pen and signed my name across the bottom of the pages. By authorizing these complex legal structures, I officially established a massive, incredibly well-funded charitable trust dedicated entirely to the protection, legal defense, and rehabilitation of elder abuse victims. I was allocating a highly significant portion of my personal wealth to ensure that those who lacked my resources, my influence, and my formidable federal connections would never have to suffer the horrifying indignity of being silently preyed upon by the very people they trusted the most. Benjamin would serve as the primary executive director of this new foundation, managing its vast resources with the same fierce, unwavering loyalty he had shown to me. As Benjamin carefully gathered the freshly signed documents, the boardroom doors opened once again. A woman stepped cautiously into the room, her eyes wide as she took in the staggering opulence of the corporate high-rise. It was Sarah. She was no longer wearing the sterile, faded medical scrubs from the private nursing agency. She wore a tailored navy business suit, looking sharp, capable, and profoundly intelligent. Sarah was the night nurse who had recognized the initial terrifying symptoms of my heavy metal poisoning. She was the one who had secretly drawn my blood, smuggled the vital samples to an independent laboratory, and bravely contacted Benjamin when she realized my own primary care physician was actively conspiring to murder me. Without her sharp medical instincts and her incredible moral courage, I would have undoubtedly perished in that bed my legacy quietly inherited by the monster who poisoned me. I offered her a warm, genuine smile, gesturing for her to approach the large mahogany table. She walked forward, her initial hesitation quickly evaporating, replaced by the quiet, unshakable confidence that had allowed her to stand firmly beside a paralyzed man fighting a dangerous, invisible war against a ruthless criminal syndicate. I gestured toward the empty leather chair situated directly to my right. Sarah took the seat, folding her hands neatly on the polished surface of the table. I looked at her with a profound sense of gratitude and absolute respect. I did not invite her to this towering high-rise merely to thank her for saving my life. I had a very specific, highly strategic proposition for her. I informed her that my corporation was aggressively expanding its massive investment portfolio into the private healthcare sector, acquiring cutting-edge medical facilities and funding revolutionary pharmacological research. I needed someone to personally oversee this massive new division. I did not want a traditional corporate shark driven solely by profit margins and ruthless greed. I needed an executive director with boots on the ground, medical experience, fierce dedication to patient advocacy, and an absolutely incorruptible moral compass. I offered Sarah the position right then and there. I told her that she would have a massive operating budget, complete autonomy over facility acquisitions, and a direct line to my office. She stared at me, completely stunned by the magnitude of the incredible offer. I saw the rapid calculation in her sharp eyes, the sudden realization that she was being handed the power to actively change the incredibly broken medical system she had navigated for years. She took a slow, deep breath, squared her shoulders, and accepted the position without a single trace of hesitation. I had lost the son I thought I had, but I reclaimed my empire, my life, and my absolute authority. Never assume the old wolf is asleep just because his eyes are closed.